Hey everyone, welcome once again to the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. And I have with me today Rebecca Martinez, who is a psychologist who specializes in adult autism evaluations. And Rebecca, welcome. I should say welcome back to the podcast, and I'll explain why. But welcome back.
Thank you so much. My daughter and I are fans of your podcast, actually.
Oh, well, wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. Well, let me explain what that comment is all about. So, you and I and another psychologist, Heather, had met about, I don't know how long it's been, at least 2 months ago to record this podcast episode. And it was fantastic. We had a really good conversation and all this stuff. And then we get to the very end of the podcast episode, and I realized that I had not pressed record on my end. And so the podcast episode wasn't recorded. So you and Heather had graciously agreed to re-record this podcast episode. Heather can't join us today because she is ill. So it's just going to be you and I doing this today, Rebecca. So.
Right. I'm sorry Heather won't be here because she had great,
She did.
um, such great feedback and
Insight.
perspective.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. So,
Yeah,
well, I
for having.
think, yeah, and what I wanted to do today, I thought it would be kind of cool to have another psychologist on this podcast episode this time because I'm a member of some autism Facebook groups, and I don't participate a lot because you get different reactions to psychologists being part of the groups, but I usually just try to lay back, but I'm very interested in what people have to say and on their perspectives about things as autistic folks. But one of the things that I come across a lot is that I'll see these comments that people will say, I'm considering getting evaluated for autism, or I just had my evaluation. But in a lot of cases, there seems to be a lot of mystery involved. And, what's this all about? I mean, what happens when you go through an evaluation? And some people are really kind of gun shy about doing it because they have either these preconceived notions about what it is, or they may have had bad experiences with helping professionals in the past. But for other reasons, for whatever reason, they just are very hesitant about going through that. So I kind of wanted us to have a conversation today just about kind of what we do and to try to kind of pull away the curtains so you can kind of see behind the curtains and kind of what happens and all that kind of stuff. But I guess a good place to start, I'm just going to ask you this question about what is it that brings adults to your office asking about autism? I mean, what is that all about? Why do people want to be evaluated? Let's start with that one.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and you talked about like how is this, let's pull the curtains back, right? One thing
Yeah.
that you both know is that there's not one way to do an autism evaluation. We're in grad school, we learn best practices, we learn not to make a high stakes diagnosis on one score, we learn about differential diagnosis, but the protocol, the process is really different and distinct based on who's doing it. So it looks
Hmm.
different. But I do think that the reasons people come to evaluation in adulthood are probably pretty similar across the board. They talk about spending all these years feeling different in ways that
Hmm.
like in ways for which there hasn't been a name or it hasn't been named before. And so, they talk about that like othered or that different. I hear the word alien a lot. A lot of people will talk
Yeah.
about I felt like an alien on this planet, right?
Yep.
Many of them, they might also describe like this pattern of social exhaustion and a lot of times also sensory overwhelm. And so they oftentimes go hand in hand. Many of them will talk about, they'll get to a point in their careers or in college or grad school, and they have a really hard time keeping up or even understanding the invisible curriculum, the invisible
Right.
rule of
Hmm.
workplace life, academic life, relational life, and they get to a point where they've done okay so far, but they've hit a wall where, career advancement or the next stage in a relationship, it's just there's a wall there, and they're just at a very emotional point when they come to evaluation. I don't think people come to an evaluation without having thought about it for a long time. It's not
Yeah.
something that is that people take lightly. Some of them come to evaluation after their kids have been diagnosed. They get their kids are
Hmm.
evaluated, and they're filling out this SRS2s and the BASCs, and they're like, oh, that's autism. I do that, right? And
Yeah,
so,
that looks familiar.
others have survived many years of misdiagnoses. So not only were they missed, but they were misdiagnosed. And so we often see anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, you name it.
Yeah.
But ADHD, and for the people who come for an autism evaluation, for them, all of these labels or some of these labels don't fully account for everything that they're experiencing. And so while someone who is autistic may have some of these other conditions, right? If it what we're looking for in evaluation is what's the most parsimonious explanation for what's going on.
Hmm.
And if someone is diagnosed, for example, with generalized anxiety disorder, it does not take away or explain the social challenges that people have had, right? And so they come with a whole host of other diagnoses, and they want to make sense of what's going on. They want a better
Sure.
explanation, right?
Yep.
Um, yeah, and I know you hear this as well, but in adulthood, they come, not for a diagnosis. They really come for clarity and self-understanding. They are coming for a narrative that matches their lived experience. And
Hmm.
it's very special in a very, like, I mean, this, it's a very privileged process to be able to walk with someone through this process and get that narrative and explain, they're not broken, they're not crazy. This
Right.
is going on. And so
Hmm.
they're coming to a point in their lives after 30, 40, 50, 70 years. I evaluated a woman who was 74.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And so they're coming for clarity for the first time in their lives. And this is where social media has been great because it's gotten the word out there, right? That autism isn't what we thought it once was
Right.
necessarily. Do you see
Yeah.
that in your practice, that that's why they
I
come to you?
see that a lot. And I think one of the things that you had mentioned is you kind of look back to when you have these conversations with people and you talk about their childhoods and what that was like for them. And
Mhm.
what you had mentioned is what I hear a lot is that I always felt I was different, but I didn't know why. I didn't know why I spent a lot of time by myself. I didn't know why I didn't want to interact with the other kids on the playground, that I was more interested in looking at daffodils or just looking at my book or doing whatever. So, and they never quite understood why they had that kind of an interest or pattern of behavior when all the other kids were doing all these other things and the kids made it look so easy. Why is it
Right?
so
Yeah.
hard? Why is it so hard for me? Or why was it so hard for me? And it still is hard for me. And I don't understand why.
Mhm.
And so I hear a lot of those stories, very, very similar types of stories. And sometimes, um, well, before I ask, I wanted to ask you another question, but before I even get to that question, let me ask you this kind of, pulling away the curtains. Could you just kind of explain how you go about doing your process? Just because I know there's a lot of curiosity about that. A lot of people, what's it like? I mean, what am I going to be asked and what am I going to have to do? Because people will have all kinds of ideas that probably might be a little bit accurate, but maybe not so accurate. So why don't you just share a little bit about what your process is, Rebecca?
Open that curtain and let you know exactly what I
Let's
do.
do it.
So I've developed this it's actually a four-part process. There's always that first part that's it's a video consultation. A lot of people will want to just sort of sign up and they know they want the evaluation, but I always want to connect with people by video initially. And that's a
Yeah.
20 to 30 minute conversation, pre-consultation questionnaire where they tell me like what, I ask why now and why
Yeah, that's a
autism, right?
good,
And we
great question. Yeah.
conversation starts then. But what it's also doing for those for whom I'm a good match and they decide to hire me to do their evaluation, I'm beginning that safety building process with that client. We've already met, like we meet 4 times. We don't just meet one time. We meet. So in
Sure.
that consultation, beginning that process. Then the first like objective, like real session is a 1 hour session, and I call it a working session. And on the surface, it's a session where the client starts filling out all the assessments. They start filling out the differential screeners and the autism screeners, and I'm working on their file. And on the outside, it's a working session, but I'm beginning to establish that rapport with the client.
Sure.
And I could very easily just send them the link to the different assessments, but I position it as I'm here to answer your questions. I'm going to be working on your file, but if you have a question about any of these questions, I want you to ask me, because it's really important that we don't overestimate or underestimate your struggle. It's really important not to, read these literally. And so I'm there for an hour with them.
Sure.
Sometimes we talk the whole time. We have, that's a whole thing. And then they do a lot for homework. And sometimes we don't talk the whole time. We don't talk at all. They don't ask any questions, and they get many of them done during that hour. And so that's how we spend that time. Um, and I find I've had a lot of people in the consultation that'll come and they'll have their cameras off. When we do that first session, I always give them, the option to do this in the way that feels safe for you. Sit on the floor
Hmm.
if you want, your camera off if you want to. And overwhelmingly, like I would say 99.9% of people I have done an evaluation with keep their camera on, which is just fabulous. So
Yeah.
then we have a second session, and it's usually the following week, and that's a 2 hour session, a full 2 hour session. For some people, it's too much, and we break it down into 2 1 hour sessions, but other people want to just get it done, and that's the clinical intake interview. And again, we've already seen each other twice before, one of those times for a full hour. And so we come into this clinical interview, and I ask them questions. I'm very anchored into the DSM criteria, but I ask these questions based on a couple of semi-structured interviews that are out there
Hmm.
that are published. And so we talk about what things were like when they were younger.
Yeah.
I ask for examples. Sometimes I focus more on one area versus another area. And it's more of a conversation, and I
Hmm.
periodically throughout the whole thing. I mean, do you have questions for me? Is there anything you want to ask me?
Yeah.
I'd like to take a break in that 2 hour process. And so there's that. And then after that, I write a report where I bring in together what we talked about in the clinical intake and then all of their assessment scores. And we have a third session, or fourth, however you look at it. And that's a 1 hour feedback session where I tell them at the very beginning what I found in like real people terms. And then I do a little PowerPoint, and we go over all their scores. And I try to talk about like broad brushstrokes, what the patterns are, and why these map onto autism and maybe why not. And then we just do a screenshot. We review the report, and I, tell them what's in the report. We look at it together. And then after that, I send them everything. I send them their PowerPoint, I send them their report, but that's the process. And it's the same process for everyone. Long, extensive, not extensive, but detailed, personalized recommendations, and also resources and things like that.
Hmm.
That's how I do it.
Very, very similar with me. The only thing I do differently is maybe I'll do the interview first and then I'll have them complete the questionnaires, but very
Yeah.
similar process. But I think that a real important part of that process is the history and whatever they can remember about childhood and what that was like for them. Because for most people, what happens during childhood sets the stage for what happens later on in life. It doesn't define it, but it just kind of sets the stage for that. And I think that's very important as part of what we call differential diagnosis as psychologists. So we want to kind of figure out, is this really autism or is something else that's going on? And I think when we talk to clients about their backgrounds and find out, especially about family, and the possibility of trauma and what types of things shape them into the person that they are today, we can kind of start to understand, okay, is this more of a trauma pattern that I'm seeing here? Or am I really starting to hear some things that are characteristic of autism? So I think that that interview is so important in shedding light on those things, and also just finding out about what they're like currently. I mean, and just to find out, okay, has that pattern been consistent over the course of time? Because you had mentioned diagnosis, that that's a very important part of diagnosis for autism, is that continual pattern throughout childhood and adulthood. So I think we're on the same page that way. So I don't think that there are any surprises, but that's the general process that psychologists follow. And the thing that I heard you say at the beginning of how you do it, you started off by saying you want to make sure that they're safe. And I thought that that was so incredibly important what you said there, because these people are coming in having been judged, having been treated poorly throughout the course of their lives, and perhaps one of the people that they've been treated poorly by is, like what I said before, maybe another mental health professional that they've worked with. So I, like you, want to make sure that these people are coming in and feel safe with me. And there are a lot of different ways that we do that as psychologists, but that's I think that's an essential that has to be part of this process. Well,
Especially,
a lot of adults wonder, if I were autistic, wouldn't someone have noticed this earlier? I mean, how do you usually respond to that kind of a question?
it's one of the more common questions that I hear.
Yeah,
I do a little bit of a history thing where I talk about how autism hasn't like historically been well recognized, and people who are verbal, have high intellectual functioning, are socially motivated, or are very skilled at compensating, and for decades, our diagnostic systems were really built around evaluating children, especially boys, with more obvious developmental differences. I know that growing up, even before grad school, I had a prototype of what autism looked like, right?
right. Yep.
And it wasn't a girl, and it wasn't someone who was verbal, and it wasn't someone who was, an engineer or a math teacher, right? Um,
It was Dustin Hoffman on Rain Man.
no, I don't know if you were, I don't know how old you are, but in St. Elmo's Fire, which was an old like a medical show, there was a doctor that had a son who was autistic, and it was so like, it was so prototypical and
Yeah,
stereotypical, like, oh, that's what autism is, right?
yeah,
And so we haven't recognized the full spectrum, right? Others like just learned that blending in was necessary, i.e., survival. And so, the story that they often hear is, well, you don't look autistic. And so what
right,
we know though is that the world wasn't equipped for them, that we didn't have a name for what they were experiencing. And so, I try to emphasize that late identification doesn't make the autism any less real. It's simply that a lot of people had to navigate, life without a language for what they were experiencing. And
right.
we now are understanding the true definition of a spectrum.
Yes,
And so that's why they weren't identified in the 80s and in the 70s and in the 60s. There just wasn't a
exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
Wasn't a thing, you know.
And there wasn't a lot, much known about it at that time either. I mean,
It's a young sort of, we have so much to learn
yeah,
about autism, so much to learn.
yeah.
So yeah, it's a very common thing, why didn't anyone notice? And that also leads to like a lot of the grief in the feedback
Oh,
session.
yeah,
when people will start to cry,
Yes.
they will talk about, I'm crying for the young me that didn't know, and
Yeah.
young me that didn't get what she or he or they needed. And that just gave me chills. Like I had one of those
Oh,
very recently, and it's just poignant
it
and
is.
feel that for them. Like, if you look at the research, the most bullied child in the school is the autistic child, whether they're diagnosed or not. So it's not the physically disabled kid. It's not, it's the autistic kid, whether they're
Yeah.
diagnosed or not. So neurotypicals have a sense for neurodivergence. And in the schools, that's who's mostly, going to be the most likely to be bullied. And so there's a long history of suffering um, and lack of acceptance that comes with a late seeking of what is this? Is there a name for this kind of what I'm experiencing?
So much of what happens in school with kids is just kind of learning how to be part of a social group and how to fit in. And it's so hard for these folks to do that. And so, but I agree with the grieving that you were talking about because I've had that reaction from clients several times. And basically, it sort of boils down to if I only would have known earlier, you know,
But don't you like see this as like the most privileged job ever to
I
do?
do.
They give us, we get the opportunity and the privilege to walk through someone's story and reframe it with their help in this new context and give them that gift. They're allowing us to give them that gift. Like, Chris, this is what we went to school for. Like, this is what it's all about, It's just an amazing thing.
It is. It is an honor to be able to do this. I totally agree. Well, let's switch to something else. Masking. So this whole concept of masking is talked a lot about in the autistic community. What function do you think masking serves for autistic folks?
Well, there's one word, and that is survival. Autistic adults it's a neurodevelopmental difference, right? And so they fundamentally have challenges in the social arena and other arenas as well. And so they learn to imitate social cues, manage their facial expressions, suppress their stimming, push through sensory distress, all of this to survive in environments that were not designed or built for them. Think about what it takes to be a successful student in elementary school. You have to sit, you have to listen to the teacher, you have to like maybe take notes, like all these things that it's an environment that wasn't built for people who are neurodivergent. And so
Right.
masking, if you know that if you're going to make it, you have to mask. And so it's a survival technique. It also allows people to avoid that bullying. If you can act as neurotypical as the kids over there, maybe these kids are not going to bother me, right? Um,
Hmm.
so sort of mitigates discrimination and job loss and social exclusion. And so it's survival, right? Masking can be very adaptive for people. But the thing is, it comes with a cost. And so the question always is, you are functioning, you got a degree, or you're keeping this job, or you're, whatever, but at what cost? That is
Yeah.
always the million-dollar question, right? And so we also know that women, because of socialization and people identified female at birth, tend to learn these compensatory, like masking strategies earlier and implement them more intensely for survival. And so that is one of the reasons we've tended to miss girls and people identified female at birth
Yeah.
more than not. And so, you know, um, it's a survival tool.
I think it's an interesting thing you mentioned the masking in women, and I've had several women contact me asking me, "What do you know about masking in autistic women?"
Mhm.
And many years ago, when I first heard that, I thought to myself, "I'm not sure I do know the difference," and so I had to really educate myself about that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that I think that what you said is that there is a cost, and how clients tell me about it is they talk about it, and I've used up my spoons, which is a popular type of basically all my energy, and of course, if that goes on long enough to burnout also. So there's a lot of downsides to doing that. It's almost like they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, you know.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
what am I going to do if I don't mask, then I don't fit in, or I'm not going to be able to keep my job or whatever. But yet, I'm kind of feeling burned out if I continue doing this. It's an awful situation to be in.
Awful. And this is where you get the overlapping anxiety and depression and
Yes,
um,
yes.
it's all layered and complicated. And, what they are coming to us is to help disentangle all that, to help understand and clarify and explain. But it can be kind of messy.
Can a client have be autistic and also be, I don't know, maybe have some sort of an anxiety problem going on, or maybe depression? Is it just one thing only, or could there be lots of things that are going on with clients?
Yes, absolutely. I mean that those we call them comorbidities or co-occurrences. It's very, very common. Whether it's actually, for example, social anxiety or autism and anxiety around those social issues, that's the disentangling piece where we have to really understand what is anxiety, what is generalized anxiety, what is social anxiety, what is what is dysthymic disorder, what is PTSD, what is CPTSD, what is OCD. We have to really understand the nuances of what it takes to diagnose these conditions, and then look and see whether there's an overlap or whether the struggle is better explained by one or the other or both. It can be very, very tricky, very, very tricky. And I think by definition, a lot of autistic people, because of how much they have struggled in their lives, they do have maybe many overlapping conditions. And I mean, we know that something like 40 to 60% of autistic people have ADHD. I don't know all the stats on
Hmm.
co-occurrence of like autism and depression and
And
autism
substance abuse. Yeah.
substance. Oh my gosh, yes, that's
Yeah.
something that I've taken a number of evaluation clients where other psychologists have been like, no, you go get sober for a year and then come and see me. But these things co-occur. But
Right.
it's very astute on how the DSM defines these different conditions, and you're able to go in and really look at them in the context of a person's life and developmental history, and across their lifespan you really can distinguish what's what and what's more than one thing. And for me it's about what most parsimoniously explains what's going on. What is explaining what's going on? Oftentimes it is just autism, and oftentimes it's not just autism.
Hmm.
But yes, they live together in the brain. They like to live together in the brain.
Yeah, and I think the reason I brought up substance use issues is because you were talking about survival
Mhm,
earlier. And I
mhm,
think that that's a way that a very quick way, and for some people, an effective way that they can survive. Although, as we were talking about before, there are consequences for certain types of behaviors. And of course, people who are artistic who are listening to this are probably nodding their heads, thinking, "Yeah, that's me. I know exactly what you're talking about." So.
mhm.
Um, let me just kind of go back to this question about, could it be autism, or could it be anxiety or depression? And here we are, psychologists, we do these evaluations all the time, and this is something that we feel is very important to be able to really accurately pinpoint what's going on. Why is it so important to pinpoint what the problem is or what the problems are? Why is that so important?
Well, in large part because accurate diagnosis then leads into appropriate interventions, accommodations, and supports, right? If we can accurately define what's going on, then we can go into solutions and help, help supports, accommodations, that kind of thing. And so it's very, very important to identify and define correctly and not misdiagnose people.
Just to kind of wrap up our interview here, I'm kind of wondering, just in terms of recommendations that you have for folks, because you had talked about in your evaluations, your reports, you'll have recommendations, and I do that as well. What do you find to be very important recommendations for folks who they're newly diagnosed and it's like, well, now what do I do? It's that question. That's a really good question. What recommendations do you have for your adult clients?
I think when I think about this, it's first and foremost for me, like, what is it that I want them to take away from this process? And that's a global sort of like, how do I want them to think and feel when they leave this process? And I want them to leave this evaluation. People call it an assessment. When you put a lot of assessments together, it's actually an evaluation, but leave the evaluation process with a more coherent story of themselves that
Hmm.
one that replaces shame, confusion, self-blame to one that is replaced by understanding and self-compassion. And that's
Yes.
like so like lofty goals, right? But that's, I want them to understand their struggles, their challenges, not as personal failures, but in, as reflections of living in a world that wasn't built for them. And however it is that they coped, maybe, contributed to a lot of their shame and confusion. You were talking about substance use and things like that. And so, so that global, I have a coherent story. I'm not broken, if they can walk away with that. I also, a global thing is I want them to walk away with some sense of agency about their next steps. The actual recommendations are so individualized. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
a foundation, sometimes
Yeah.
it's building a more sustainable lifestyle. Sometimes it's reframing or changing relationships, reducing masking, or in some cases increasing masking, right? In a certain way,
Right.
right? Um, seeking trauma-informed support or coaching or therapy. And so, the diagnosis is not the end point. I'm the first step, in this journey of like
Right.
self-acceptance and this and this like framework of like this new life, right? Of acceptance and um and like self-love and not blaming oneself. And so, it's more, I think, about these global things. I come to these feedback sessions. I'm always kind of nervous because I don't know how it's going to go. I always tell clients in the consultation, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you what the data say, what the data shows, but then also I'm going to put in my layer or my lens, my experience. But I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you what I found. I'm going to tell you the truth. And so sometimes, that feedback has to be very delicate, very honest,
Yeah.
but also in a supportive way. And that can be very challenging. And I get, I
Right.
never come to a feedback session like, oh, I've done this before. Never. That has never happened. They're all so different. Um, and then ultimately, like, the neurodivergent community is one of openness and advocacy and there's another word I'm thinking of and it's gone away, but advocacy and allyship. And it's a wonderful time, I think, in our history to be autistic, to be neurodivergent. And the tribe is out there, and I want people to find their tribe.
Just to kind of sum it up, everything that you were just talking about is what we talk about as a neuroaffirmative approach to evaluation and helping people. And I really appreciate that you come across that way. I mean, you're very genuine in how you describe yourself and how you kind of work with clients, and I appreciate that. But the only other thing I wanted to ask, because it kind of popped into my mind, because people, oftentimes it takes a long time for a person to contact a psychologist to go through the process. And it's like, okay, I think I'm ready for this. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think I'm finally ready to do this. But in some cases, they go through the process and they're not autistic.
Yeah.
How do you how do you deal with that with clients? Because that's happened so many times with me, and it's not an easy conversation to have because it's always, well, if it's not autism, what is it? So how do you deal with that, or how do you kind of have a conversation about that?
Honestly, you know what, through honesty, transparency, explanation, like why are they not autistic? In the same way that I do psychoeducation about why someone is autistic, I do it about why they are not autistic. One of the things I'm really struggling with right now is this whole like this new language around, maybe categories of autism versus a spectrum of autism. And so it like I want to make sure I'm not over diagnosing, but I also want to honor self
Yeah,
identification. And so it's very delicate. I walk this very fine line between being in the medical, like a medical provider, and I adhere to the science and I have a license that I have to in my ethics guidelines and all that. But I'm also very neuro affirming, and we get to decide what our intersecting identities are. You get to decide who and what you are.
right.
And so, when I do have those cases where it's not autism, I just tell them, and I do psychoeducation. I explain why that is, and still have recommendations, and we still talk about next steps, and what I think this could mean for their lives. And honestly, I haven't had. I worry more. I am more anxious, I think, when I come to these sessions because when they're not autistic, and I'm going to give them that feedback that they're going to be mad or they're going to be very disappointed. But overwhelmingly, there's like a sense of relief because they have answers. And I think I do a pretty good job in the very beginning in the consultation to ask people not to come invested in an outcome, but to come invested in getting information. Be
Hmm.
invested in an outcome, you might be disappointed because
Yeah, that's really important.
it's super important. And I've had people where we've done a consultation and they don't hire me to do their evaluation, and that's okay. That's
Right.
perfectly okay. But it's all complicated. It's all challenging. It's all beautiful. It's all a privilege. But what do you do with your clients who you've done this really extensive?
Yeah, it's like it's honesty and it's empathy. Um, because I know that for some clients, they have done research, they have taken tests online themselves, they've watched TikTok videos, and everything, all the information that they've gathered, they have used that to kind of build the case for I am autistic. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. But I think that I try to balance that fine line as well, Rebecca. This is what I found through the process that I used,
Mhm.
but there are plenty of people who still self-identify as autistic, and nothing can take that away from you.
And they're still legitimate. There's the whole. I often, when they don't meet the criteria, I'll talk about the broad autism phenotype, where, if we have people in our families that are autistic, it's such a genetically loaded condition that, many of us have autistic qualities or autistic features. And if you
Right.
want to identify as autistic, no one's going to take that from you.
That's
But
right.
But if we're talking purely medical model, which, I there's a place, a time and a place for the medical model, it's very clear what it is and what it's not very clear. It is clear what it is and what it's not. The deciphering part is hard, but it's very it's written down. We know what it is and
Yeah,
what it and so and that's it's also kind of nuanced and really complicated in the context of someone's life story, right?
that's right. That's right. Well, Rebecca, a lot of people are listening to this and may be interested in being evaluated. Is this something that you can do if somebody lives, I don't know, across the United States? Is this something that you're able to do through telehealth? Kind of talk about that if you would.
Well, you and I both have what's called PsyPact, which is an endorsement when you're a licensed psychologist to practice across state lines. Most states, California and New York are not two of them, will allow us to practice across state lines. And so I have a purely telehealth practice, and most of my clients are outside of the state from where I am licensed. But so yeah, most of my clients are from all over. So yes, I can practice not face to face.
And how can they get a hold of you if they're interested in being evaluated by you?
So I have a website. It's called adultautismspecialist.com, and I they can book a consultation directly on the website, or they can email me, or they can call me. There's never any like pressure to sign up to do anything. It's just, we start with just a conversation. So they're welcome to
Yeah.
contact me that way. Thank you
That's
for
that's a
asking.
great way to start. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me today for this conversation. I hope that we've clarified things for folks who have kind of been a little hesitant about going through with an evaluation process. And if they have any questions, they can certainly reach out to you through email with me as well. I don't mind answering questions at all about anything about how this whole process works. But thanks again for joining me, Rebecca, and you have a good rest of the day.
Likewise, thank you so much.
Okay.